begin. Bonjour, good evening, Tansi. I would like to welcome all honorable senators and members of the public who are watching this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, either here in the room or listening via the web. I would like to acknowledge, for the sake of reconciliation, that we are meeting on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin peoples. My name is Lillian Dick from Saskatchewan, and I have the privilege and honor of chairing the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. I will now invite my fellow senators to introduce themselves, starting on my right with the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dennis Patterson, Senator for Nunavut.
Scott Tanis from Alberta.
Norman Doyle, Newfoundland.
Nancy Green-Rain from BC.
Tobias Berger from Ontario.
Kim Tait from Ontario.
Murray Sinclair, Manitoba.
René Dupuis, Québec. Anne-Françoise Mégy, Québec.
Dan Christmas, Nova Scotia.
Charlie Watt, Nunavik.
Mary Lou McFedrin, Manitoba.
Thank you, Senators. Before we begin our exciting evening, we have two pieces of housekeeping to take care of. First of all, we need a motion for filming and photography.
So moved.
Is it agreed? Agreed. Thank you, Senators. The second, for this evening today, we required a small budget. Due to timing, we asked for emergency funds to do so. As per Senate rules, the budget now has to be approved through the usual process, starting with the committee. Is it agreed that the budget distributed to senators for the purpose of Indigenize the Senate Day be adopted?
Agreed.
Agreed? Thank you, Senators. Now we can move to the main event. This evening, we are happy, very happy, to host our second annual Indigenous Youth Leaders Forum. We have 9 youth from across the country who have been participating in activities and workshops all day long. These youth have a variety of backgrounds and experiences, and we are very lucky to have them before us today. Today, our meeting is continuing our study on creating a new relationship between the Crown and First Nations, Métis and Inuit in Canada. Each young person, each youth leader, will have a few minutes to present, followed by a question or two from senators. We have just over 10 minutes for each youth this evening, and we will begin with our youth with Ms. Jennifer Obamsawin. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Hi everyone, Kwai and Daliwaze Sanepel, Orotene Yatse. Hi, my name is Jennifer Obamsawin. I'm going to do my speech in French, just to be sure. On m'a demandé de présenter un petit peu.
I was asked to talk about my experience as a newly elected co-chair of the National AFN Council. I would add that I'm also the youth representative for the province of Quebec, responsible for Northern Quebec and Labrador. And regionally, I represent the Wendake and Odanak communities, and that's why I'm here today. I've always been part of a very engaged, committed family where volunteering was essential. And our idea was to seize upon the opportunity to change the world and do something worthwhile. Both my parents are First Nations members. I've always lived in a First Nations community as well. It was essential for me to change things, and I thought it was absolutely irresponsible and unfair to say that we weren't all equal. So I want change, and this desire has motivated me. I'm involved in politics now, and I'm trying to change things, indeed, change the experience and the life of First Nations. I started when I was 12 years old. I organized a march for improvements to the lives of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. I was 12 years old, and I tried to recruit people in my community. I thought it was deplorable that people didn't have access to education and to running water, etc. I'm fortunate enough to come from a community that is doing very well, much better than others. And I thought it was very sad and tragic that others didn't have the same opportunities. So as I said, I organized this march when I was 12. Then I was engaged in all sorts of other activities to mobilize young people, to recruit other young people who wanted to change things because together we're stronger. And that was my motivation. I then became involved in the Réseau Jeunesse des Premières Nations and at the National Youth Council. And that led to various activities, among them this one. I'd like to thank you for having invited me to say a few words about my people. The experience I acquired over time strengthened my identity. I have a strong identity, and this gave me a dream, that of changing the political reality for First Nations. I've always wanted to create a government for First Nations since my childhood, a government that would be equal and that would allow us to represent ourselves. It's a crazy dream, perhaps, but we're young, and that's what youth are good at, dreaming. And I swear that I will succeed one day. I don't know how, but certainly with my colleagues who are seated here with me. There are barriers that you encounter when you're a young Aboriginal woman. It's not easy. And I'm a Francophone Aboriginal woman, so in an Anglophone milieu, it isn't easy. But that's what pushes me to continue to knock on doors and open doors for those following behind me. Everything that I do for those who are following me and those who went before me and opened the way for me. So I'm trying to change things and to ensure that my children, my grandchildren, and their children have a better world, so that in the future there's no longer any distinction between being First Nations and being Canadian. It would be good if we all had one and the same identity, although we do have a rich history that we want to share, and in part it's yours as well. I think it's essential to have opportunities such as this forum this afternoon. I was fortunate to meet with young people from throughout Canada who shared their ideas. They talked to me about the world that they imagined, and it motivated me to know that our dreams were quite similar. We're dreaming of a world where everyone is equal, where people have better living conditions, and where First Nations can take their place and be proud of who they are. And pride is what pushes me to continue day after day and to want to change things, because I'm deeply proud of being who I am, and I will always be so. I also think it's important to be resilient, because I come from a very resilient people. This is why still today we can say that we're First Nations in Canada. We are a very resilient people, and this is important. Even if it's difficult and requires a lot of effort and time, I will never give up, because I do have an objective, and I always think of those who are coming up behind me, and they need a forum such as this to speak out. As I said, I'm dreaming of an autonomous Aboriginal government in Canada. I'm dreaming for this, and I also at the same time want to belong to your Canada with a nation-to-nation relationship. What does this mean? Well, respect on both sides. And the two must be equal nations in this relationship. I would like our relationship to be easier as well. People ask me, how do you see yourself in 20 years? Well, in 20 years, I hope that most of my dreams will have been achieved. I hope I'll have other dreams as well between now and then. And I do hope that all communities in Canada will have access to clean water, and that First Nations children won't be penalized. That they will have pride in their identity. I'm hoping for everything for all peoples in this beautiful country I hope to raise my children in 20 years' time. For me, it's also important to have a very strong culture, a strong language. I come from two communities where the language was lost. I've learned a few words, but the languages themselves disappeared. Sometimes, even if you just know one or two words in your language, it's enough to make your ancestors proud of you. And I do hope that I'll be able to have a strong cultural meaning in my life in 20 years' time. I want to see us work concretely together, side by side, because we're part of the same country. And I do hope that these few words will inspire you somewhat. I spoke a bit about who I am, what I'm dreaming for and of. And if you have questions, I'd be delighted to try to answer them. And I hope that you'll never forget the Aboriginal peoples throughout Canada. We're a large population. Never forget us. Make room for these young people so that they can express themselves and achieve their dreams, because they're a strong people. And opportunities such as this will hopefully help us build a better future for all of us. Thank you.
From senators, starting with Senator Métis and then Senator Doyle.
Thank you very much. That's a wave of fresh air to see all of these young people here. Each of you certainly has a dream. I wrote down pride, language, even if Aboriginal languages are disappearing to some extent, and equality for all. We talked a lot about respect, and people told us that what's important for you is to retain your ancestral values. How do you see this? Ancestral values? And everything that's taking place today, social media, etc. It's a new wave, a new world. How can you reconcile this new wave, what's being offered to you, and retaining everything that maintains the contact between you and your ancestors? Well, for me, it's important to keep in touch with my culture through ceremonies. That's how I experience this. And with this political role that is mine, I can go back to our origins. I can go back to the desires of our ancestors, change-wise, and what the community is expecting of me. Through ceremonies, that's how I recognize who I am. I also am taking Abenaki language classes to be able to better express myself and not lose this. I want to see a rebirth of this language. And these two aspects of who I am are very important to me. That's why I am who I am today. I always use my ancestral language, but I'm on Facebook, I use Twitter, I have a cell phone. This is how we'll survive. We have to put the modern world and our traditions together. I think that's what will save us. But personally, it's through ceremonies. I'm always learning. It's an ongoing process, and it's essential to always go back to one's origins, to the source, because you must never lose track of who you are, where you come from. Thank you.
Yeah, it would certainly seem to me that the future of Indigenous people is in very good hands with the very impressive people that we've seen today. Jennifer, if it was in your hands, what measures do you think you'd like to take to, is there any one thing that stands out? What measures would you like to take to improve relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people?
I believe that if I had just one measure to take to begin with, it would be to recognize or to seek recognition of First Nations, as human beings who have the same rights as other Canadians. I think that's the way of going about this, to work on a nation-to-nation basis. Several commissions and recommendations have been out there that we've discussed. And there are lists of ideas that have been discussed. I think we have to be well aware of this and not forget all the work that's already been done. Sometimes we simply put commission reports and other documents on a shelf, gathering dust. But I think we have to be aware of what's been done in the past, and we have to connect with young people. I think that Aboriginal young people are the key to success. And I think it's in connecting with them and asking them what kind of Canada they would like to grow up in that will find a solution, because they're going to be coming up soon and they should be listened to. Perhaps there should be a connection with the elders too, who know the past. That might be a solution. With regard to First Nations, it would be good to have more senators and more MPs from our communities who could represent our interests at the table here with you. So people who understand us and could well represent us.
Senators, we'll only have time for 2 questions for each representative, so we will now move on to Stephen Puskas. The floor.
Hi, my name is Stefan Uglubak Puskas from Yellowknife. My mother's side of the family is from the Kivalliq region in Nunavut, from Rankin Inlet, Whale Cove. And I've been living in Montreal for about almost the past 9 years. I guess when it comes to my achievements recently is I've worked in research for Nunalijuak. It was a research project asking the question why Montreal is so different compared to Ottawa. The two cities are so close to each other. But for the Inuit communities, they're so different, where Ottawa has so much, but Montreal has had so little. From there, I did research and an internship at the Museum of History. I spent 2 months researching Indigenous creation stories across Canada for the New Canada History Hall, and I've done other research projects there as well, all around culture, researching my cultural heritage, my history. And when I came back to Montreal, I helped start up the first Inuit community radio show in southern Canada called Nipivut, which means our voice in Inuktitut. After that, I had the opportunity to speak publicly about many things that I have been seeing happening in the South. Where I come from in the North, I would see Indigenous businesses, Indigenous politicians, and leaders. But when I came down south to Montreal, I would see a lot of Indigenous, or in this case, Inuit identity used by non-Inuit for a corporate identity. So I started speaking out about a lot of these things, and people started listening. And from there, I was able to have public discussions and talk in universities and schools about raising cultural awareness about Inuit in Montreal. And then I got the opportunity to co-curate the first Inuit film festival in southern Canada in Montreal called Tilutarnit. And since then, I've done an internship at CBC, and I've been writing stories, been interested in stories about Inuit or Indigenous representation from non-Indigenous storytellers. I think we are surrounded by art, and this art and these symbols tell us stories. They symbolize where we come from, who we are, what we believe in, what we value. These stories are also used to educate ourselves. They're used to explain sometimes, or try to explain, what we don't know. And I think right now, when it comes to reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous people, I think it's very important to try to look at the ethics of storytelling of Indigenous stories from non-Indigenous storytellers, because there's a lot of Indigenous stories being told that is actually being publicly funded, while at the same time, the people where these stories come from are not being funded in telling these stories. So I think that's basically my message right now, and that's about it.
Thank you, Stephen. Senator Verga, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today. We're impressed with all your credentials and so far with all the students right now here. So I understand that you're more into filming and into arts, right? But you want to tell a story. I mean, with all your experiences and with all the things that you've done, I mean, where do you see your community right now? I mean, how would you, let's say, end your story? I mean, where do you want to end it? What kind of story do you want to present to the whole nation?
What kind of story? I guess when it comes from my community,
Yeah.
I really would rather try to provide a voice for my community to tell their own story, because I have not been elected or selected to represent them. I often say that I'm only here representing myself. So I think in a lot of the work that I've done, like with Nipivut, I really think for me, it's more important to try to provide an opportunity for other Inuit in the community to have a space and an opportunity where they can tell their own stories. And I also recently made a film called Ukiotaktumi, which means in the north. And it's actually a film that I took videos from social media and from YouTube of Inuit. And I've gotten their permission to use their videos. And it's more of a film about Inuit self-representation. And I first showed the film to the Inuit who provided the videos and asked them for permission and asked them if this is all right. So I think when it comes to telling the story of the community that I come from, I think it's much more important for me to actually provide the opportunity and a space for the community themselves to tell their own story.
Thank you. Senator Christmas.
Thank you, Stephen. And over lunch, we had a very interesting conversation about Stephen's career in the filmmaking business, and I was quite struck by your comments about how um, there are films out there today that are not authentic in terms of portraying the Inuit community.
Yeah.
Could you describe why you felt some of those films were not authentic and what can be done in the future to make sure that the authentic story of the Inuit is told in Canada?
I think a lot of these stories are not authentic because they don't include Inuit as decision makers or in any part of the creative process. There's a film that came out recently and it's been winning awards this past year called Living of Giants. And they have the young man, the Inuk, wearing a wolf mask. And I interviewed the directors, and they told me that it was their idea to make this wolf mask and to have him wear it. And these directors are not Inuit, and not Indigenous, and they come from the South. They use that as a poster, basically, for the movie, and they use it as a way to foreshadow his suicide. So I think it's very important to have Inuit, in this case, when it comes to Inuit film, involved in actually a lot of these decision-making processes when a lot of these films get public funding, when a lot of these films are being made, not just to get approval at the final stages when the film is already done. I've also been a mentor at a film festival in Montreal called RIDM, where I had a talk with 9 filmmakers. 8 of them were non-Indigenous, and all of them were making films about Indigenous people. And I was talking to them about the ethics of telling stories that do not come from your own community. So I think there are a lot of films out there being made right now, not just films, but art. Like even right now in Ottawa, the largest mural that will be put up in Ottawa right now is a mural that represents Inuit, and it's made by non-Inuit artists. And I think that would be a great embarrassment for the capital of Canada to have the largest art piece here in this city to be a stereotypical depiction of Inuit made by non-Inuit and without Inuit consultation.
Thank you. So, we'll now move on to our third youth leader, Perry Kootenhayoo. I hope I pronounced your last name reasonably correctly, Perry.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Perry Kootenhayoo. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. I do a lot of volunteer work, so some of my accomplishments were provincial recognition in Alberta for the contributions that I've made. Through Spinal Cord Injury Alberta, I've had the opportunity to deal with newly injured, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal clients. And while they're still in rehabilitation hospital, I would go in and kind of be somebody who could help them integrate themselves, not just physically, socially, but mentally back into society. And doing that and helping them has also helped me grow as a person and allowed me to be, here speaking with you guys today. So that's how that's kind of shaped me. As for where I see myself in 20 years, I believe, and I honestly do believe when I say this, that I will be right where I have to be. I will be doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and what I'm doing here today is just helping me get there. So this is a cornerstone for me as a leader to get where I need to be in the future. I believe that some of those steps towards the reconciliation between the government and our people would be to provide also programs in the mental health side of things, where people can adjust from the wave of the history that has happened to my people, not just to the individuals where they were the ones who were affected by it, but their children and their children's children are still feeling the ripple from these traumatic events in the past. Now, as for the history of it, I feel that it could be integrated into our educational system on a national level, where everybody is taught the history, and it's not looked down upon nor thrown into shade in any way or form. It's taught so that it's a lesson and that it may never be repeated again. And that's how I feel about that, I guess. And I mean, I don't have too much to say. I'll just open the floor for questions as it is.
Thank you. Senator Reid, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, and I truly appreciate what you're doing with victims of accidents, because in those first few weeks after you have had a really bad injury and your whole life is changing, for somebody to be there and hold out that hope to them is so important. So could you talk to me a little bit about how you grew to find that hope and how you now can see yourself as someone who can spread hope, not just for people who have suffered spinal cord injury, for example, but for people who have suffered generally?
How I find hope, I mean, because when I was first injured and in general in life, that it wasn't brought to me a lot, so I didn't have the type of services that I'm helping others with. So I find it that if I can provide to those people, and they don't have to go through kind of this mental stuff that I've gone through, and by doing that, I hope to instill what I, give them hope, but they also give me hope that they can one day maybe go out and do the same thing as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, if I may myself ask you a question, I'm wondering, in your work, do you find that your cultural background is an advantage to you in the work that you're doing? Is there some benefit that helps you in connecting with other people?
Yes, the cultural background, especially cultural stuff. Growing up, I wasn't around my family a lot, so being taught the lessons that I was taught, the respect of one another, the sharing circle, for directions, and using this to adapt into basically the workplace and the ability to share it with others, not like on a lesson standpoint, but through just day-to-day activities is what helped me personally, and that's what shaped me, was through the culture.
Thank you. Any other questions from a senator? Senator Patterson.
Yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about your ideas about providing support for the ripple of past trauma as you described it. Are you suggesting that there are a lot of people who have gone through, say, the residential school history who could benefit from mental health services? And how would you see that happening?
Providing them with supports. I mean, they have their process of grieving, and maybe they're not being guided properly, and the grief itself is not being dealt with. But in the community where I'm from, I see a lot of it that's passed down through some of it negative influences, addictions, and then those addictions are then passed on just because the youth are seeing them growing up, and they think this is what's normal. But if we can, so to speak, stop it where it started and help those from the beginning deal with it, then they themselves can show that the younger generations do have a chance to change.
Thank you.
Senator Sinclair.
The question that I had goes back to the issue that Senator Dick raised, our chair, and that was the importance of culture and your understanding of culture. I wonder if you might share with us what your experience is with regard to the importance of culture to those that you work with, to those that you help.
Okay, some of them, when they're first injured, the cultural side of aspect, especially for Aboriginals in that setting, it goes out the window for them at first because they're going through a lot at that time. But if I can slowly help them integrate it back into their daily lives, cultural support in itself, spiritually, will brighten anyone's day. You're feeling down, you say a prayer, you do what you can. And if just that, in general, that little help that I can give to them is enough to push them through the day, then that's the way I like to see things are.
And do you think there's enough support that's provided to programs that you might work with, or to you, or to others to do that kind of work?
I mean, there could always be more, but at the same time, there could always be less. Everything's perspective, right? So, of course, you can say that there would be need for more of it influenced through other communities and helped by the government. And at the same time, like I said, it could not be there at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Perry. We'll now move on to our fourth youth leader, Holly Sock. And while we do that, I would like to say welcome to Senator Omidvar, who came in a little bit after we did our introduction. So pleased that you're here. You have the floor, Holly.
Okay. Hi, I'm Holly Sock. I'm from Elsipogtog First Nation, New Brunswick. I'm 26 years old. I'm currently working out of Tobic First Nation. My achievements, when I was 14 years old, I was given a task to create a nursery rhyme CD in my language, which is the Mi'kmaq language. Back then, it was just a small gesture. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It was just me doing something for the younger kids, which was something I enjoyed to do, was to be with the younger kids. And I didn't think it would make the impact it did today. Knowing that I can continue to teach our language through song is something that I take a lot of pride in. And it's something that'll go on. If it's been going on for this long, you know, that CD is still being made, that CD is still being sold, I take no profit in that. The profit goes right back into the Head Start, the daycares, to have the toys, the playgrounds, the snacks that they needed for some of these kids who might not have the money to come in with such things like snacks. It made me realize how important it is to give back to my community as much as I can, and to continue to be a role model to a child who needs you the most. Something else that I take a lot of pride in, and I was the first female to go out and join the RCMP out of my community. I hope to inspire more young women, not only from Elsipogtog, but from Tobic and from other First Nations community in New Brunswick, to join and to take that leap to have such a great career, because it really is. I really enjoy my job. Some of the barriers I had to overcome, I'm a very shy person. I don't know if you guys can tell in my voice, but I am a very shy person, and that's something that I had to come and beat, you know, to take any opportunity that was provided to me, and I did that by coming here. And it's something that I try to teach a lot of the younger youth in my community, is to go out and go for it, because our community is so small and the world is so big, and it has so many career paths that they can go out and become so good at. You don't know until you try. For example, I didn't know how to read in my language when I first took on the task of making the CD. I had no clue. My mom had no clue. And it was something that we did together. And it took me a whole summer to make that CD, to sit down and to be able to teach myself how to read in my language is spectacular now, because I had no clue. I always tell the youth to go out and try. Even something as small as just finish high school. Okay, let's look at finishing high school. Okay, you did that. All right, let's try for university, because you don't know what you're gonna get into when you get there. You don't know what you're gonna like and what you're gonna be good at. You know, you might go in thinking you want to be a psychologist. You might turn around and be such a scholar in anthropology and thrive to be an anthropologist. That's something I try to teach the youth as much as possible, whether it be in Elsipogtog or Tobic. Where do I see myself in 20 years? I hope to have made a small impact in every community that I've decided to police in. When I talk to people, and it's funny because they'll call me Officer Sock, and I'm like, no, I'm Holly. And my name is Holly, and I'm a police officer. I'm not the police. I'm a police officer. So I try to put myself to their level to make me seem beyond the uniform, that I'm not the word across my chest. And, I hope for myself to make it to be a staff sergeant, to join identification services. I don't know where I'll live, but I'll hope to have seen a lot of First Nation communities, and I hope to make a small impact on every single one of them, whether it be with youth, whether it be with elders, whether it be with single mothers. I hope people see beyond the police sign. For me, my culture is my backbone. I was raised in a very traditional family, and it's something that I take a lot of pride in. Being clean and sober is something that I'm proud of, and to be raised in a family that's been clean and sober my whole life is amazing. I thank my mom for that. Without my culture, I'd be lost. My faith in a higher power, my faith in the Creator, beyond mankind, is what keeps me grounded. And if somebody knew how many times I prayed before putting sage into my work boots, each and every shift, just so that I can keep my spirit positive and keep it from being tainted from what I'm about to see during the day. In training, numerous times, if I counted how many times I reached into my pocket and grabbed that piece of sage and smelled it just to calm myself down, I don't know what I would do without that kind of belief. I really don't. And I take a lot of pride in my culture. To me, a new relationship between Indigenous people and Canada means to be able to walk alongside each other in balance. There's an inequity. It's not Canada with Indigenous people. It's not Indigenous people with Canada. It's Canada and Indigenous people together, working together in a positive way, in a good way for everyone. Education is something that was brought up to me with the youth earlier today. And it amazed me how minimal Canada knew about Indigenous people and the amount people knew about our culture and how proud people are to be who we are today. And I think I'll open the floor for any questions at this point.
Thank you. Senator Sinclair, to be followed by Senator McFedry.
I hope I don't embarrass you with this question.
I'll try not to be embarrassed.
I'd like to ask you to sing us one of your songs.
Yeah, I can. Just a small verse.
Whatever you want to give us.
All right. Okay, I'll sing this one. I got to do a little introduction to it because it's very important. It was written by a woman who taught me as a child, and she's passed now. And she wrote a song and didn't really tell anybody about it, and just kind of stuffed it away into this folder that was handed to me when I was 14 years old. And I came across it, and I just thought it was the most beautiful thing ever. And we some amazing people came together and put the music behind it, and I'm forever grateful for that. And this is called Ninin Namigamajij. Ninin Namigamajij. Elsie book to go out Ninin Bamadueg. El Madigam get away, well, the young way we nin. Well, ginam winen, suara winen bit, no la wedu kwe winen. Ginam winen, migame way, men aninen, siawadis anen, don deli el nuig. Ginam winen, don deli el nui sieg. Ninin a mega magish got Maggie dead a meg.
Okay, so everybody who's following you now is thinking, why did she not go last? Thank you very much. That was beautiful.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Senator McFedrin.
I think, keeping with the healing quality of what you've just shared with us, Holly, I'm not going to ask for any negative impressions of your work, but I would like to ask if, based on your experience in your work, you'll be well aware of many of the concerns that women associated with the RCMP have had. And I'm wondering if you could share, though, when you think about, when you're putting the sage in your boots and you're putting yourself and keeping yourself in a positive place, if you were to give one thing of advice for the force more generally, in relation to the women working in the force, would you have any future positive suggestion?
I think it would just be to remember to respect yourself as a woman. You know, we go in for training, we're all built like machines there, like the Mountie factory. But we come out and we still have our own values and our own beliefs, and I think it's important for us to be able to hang on to those and to remember who you are and where you come from when you're in that kind of workplace.
Senator Verga.
Thank you again. And I was actually hoping for you to give another song, but no, I don't want to do that. Yeah, people must be thinking you must be in the wrong job here. You should be somewhere in the limelight out there. But yeah, my question is more like, I understand that you're into law enforcement, and how do you see the youth? I mean, we heard so much things about the suicide, youth suicide. I mean, have you dealt with them? How do you? What can you say about that? What can you say to other youth who is thinking about this, doing the same thing? I mean, do you have any message for them?
I did work with youth before I left. Before I went to training, I worked with youth that were dealing with mental health issues, specifically in suicide. And I would just kind of give them hope again for that. Go out and try for it. You know, just trying to keep them in a safe space, trying to remind them that, you know, it's just a bad day, not a bad life. I know law enforcement ain't for everybody, and I don't try to force it on anybody. But if it was something that they're thinking about, I am open to talk freely about it with them, to remind them about how important it is that you're ready to take on the mental challenges that you may be faced with, and how I keep myself grounded in those situations, and just try to be that positive role model that they might need, if whether it be, you know, if they want to be RCMP officers or not. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly, and especially I thank you for that beautiful song. For someone who's shy, you really know how to belt it out beautifully. We will now move on to our next presenter, Modeste McKenzie.
Good evening, Tansei. Bonjour.
Good evening.
Follow. I am a dancer, however, and I will gladly hop on this table and do a jig for you if you want. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Oh, I need a fiddle. That's yeah.
Tunes on my iPhone. So
Yeah. Perhaps. I'd like to start off by thanking the senators, Madam Chair, for having me here today. It is truly an honor. I'd like to thank all of my peers as well, just to even be considered, being in that same caliber is really an honor. And I've enjoyed spending the day with you, learning with you all, and talking with you all. So I'll start off my story. I am 22 years old. I am from the Kootenhayoo First Nation, Northwest Territories. My father was taken from his family in the early 70s, and he was raised by my other grandmother and my other grandfather in Montreal. So he was a 70s scoop baby. My mother is from Cumberland House, and she is Métis. My parents met in Winnipeg at a theater company called Red Roots, I believe. And while I was while I was unborn, my mom decided to move to Regina, and that's where I was born, and that's where I spent the first 7 years of my life. My family did experience some hardships while in Regina, trying to escape poverty. One of my siblings went missing in Regina. Fortunately, we found my sibling. But I remember being very young and putting up missing signs around Regina. I don't talk about that much, but that's something that was really hard. After that, I moved to L'Orange, and I spent the next 6 years of my life there, and I met some really great people, great friends, great elders, great mentors. After that, I then moved to Rostern, and that is where my mother got a job working for Batoche National Historic Site. And that's where I truly became in touch with my culture, with my Métis side. That's where I became in touch with my dancing. It's where I met Elder Maria Campbell, and she mentored me for three summers, and still continues to do so once in a while. Kim Andersen, Christy Belcourt, Neil McLeod. Growing up around these artists, their passions was just naturally passed on to me. And I'd like to backtrack a little bit though, but Batoche that's where I truly became in touch with my culture. It's where I started learning about my ancestry, about the 1885 resistance, about Almighty Voice, about Louis Riel, about Gabriel Dumont. And that has inspired me to this day. Knowing that they're rooting for me, knowing that they fought for me, and I will continue to do so for the unborn. That's a bit about who I am. Currently, right now, I'm a youth support worker with the Lac La Ronge Indian Band. And as some of you are aware, back in October, the Lac La Ronge Indian Band went through a suicide crisis. 4 young girls between the ages of 10 and 14 committed suicide. And to the best of my knowledge, there was at least 70 more attempts within the community that month. So shortly after, I was hired. But what really motivates me is that 3 weeks after that crisis, those 4 young girls took their lives, I myself had a child born. her name is Natalia. And that's what really put things into perspective to me. That made me go, holy cow. You know, I'm not just, you know, fighting, you know, for myself and for my peers, but for this young child, for my child. In terms of, you know, reconciliation, what I would like to see, education. It is the most important thing. There are a couple elementary schools in my tribe community area. And if you drew a line between one and the other, there'd probably be about 3 kilometers. You'd have to go through some bush. The kids on reserve get 40% less what the kids in the village get. And why do they get 40% less? Why would my daughter get 40% less than those kids who are only a few kilometers away? And it's because they're First Nations. It's because they're Indigenous. They're Indians. Seeing that, that's my motivation. And working with those children. This past winter and spring, I had the pleasure and the opportunity to bring my skills and my talents to those youth. And I got to form a little square dance group. It was a lot of fun. So that would be one thing. And also, I touched on this a little bit earlier with some senators, is the inclusion of First Peoples in the economy and the development of our own economies, something that's not based on resource extraction, something where we're not damaging our lands, not harming our fish, not harming our waters, not harming the plants. That's a big one for me, and part of that ties in with education, because in order to have a robust economy, a diversified economy, we need education. It is absolutely key, and it is absolutely critical. And also increased mental health services. You know, better partnerships. Provinces need to work with individual nations. The federal government needs to step up more and do more. It just blows my mind how far some of our youth have to go to get the proper services. How far some of our elders have to go to get some just basic services. And those roads up there aren't the best. We got big trucks hauling uranium from northern Saskatchewan, hauling them down south, and they really tear up the roads. And I think really looking and examining those corporations that are operating in our territories, that are generating profits from our territories, making sure they're paying their fair share. I can think of one company in particular in the territory that I work in that does not. And further down the road, you know, I would like to see the development of our own economies. You know, in 20 years, where do I see myself sitting? Hopefully amongst you, or in the other house. But I think really just right now my main focus is the youth, nurturing, listening, and advocating anytime I can. So I'll open the floor to some questions now if anybody has any.
Thank you, Modeste.
Thank you.
Well, I'm from Saskatchewan, and Lac La Ronge First Nation is actually a fairly prosperous First Nation, is it not? Could you comment on, you were talking about development in economies and you know how that's important, but yet economies that are environmentally friendly.
Well, Lac La Ronge is very successful, but you know, there's other communities in northern Saskatchewan. There's Dene communities, there's Wollaston, there's Fond du Lac, there's Black Lake, and those are very isolated communities, unemployment, and even in Larange too. Just even down south, it's not where it should be. It's when you compare it to the national average, it's just not where it should be. And what was the other part of the question? Sorry, I couldn't really hear you.
Just in terms of developing economies, and now you've mentioned the more isolated, remote communities. How do you envision those communities becoming more self-reliant, given that they are remote and isolated? Do you have some insights into that?
Absolutely. Larange held this great program. It was called NORTEP.
Oh,
and
yes. NORTEP?
NORTEP. It's going to be shut down. It's shut down now.
That's right.
But what NORTEP was so if you lived in northern Saskatchewan for half your life or 10 years, regardless of your ethnicity or if your status or not, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, you got to go to the school for free. And the idea behind the program was to improve retention rates in regards to teachers, right? So, education would be one, really. That would be probably the big one. And just trying to, I guess, that's a hard question. That's a good one, and it's going to take a lot of thought, but I guess education would be the main component for now. That's the first step, I guess, in that direction for me, I think.
Yeah. So any specific recommendation? You mentioned, and this committee has studied education in the past, and we did do a report on the funding. We recognize that the funding that you mentioned is a real problem. So what, if you were in charge, what would you do to rectify that?
Equal or equitable. Just close the gap.
Yeah.
Close the gap and focus on post-secondary institutions like NORTEP. It was a great program. 95% of those graduates from NORTEP stayed, or 94, it was very high, stayed within northern Saskatchewan or went back to their communities. And those are good paying jobs, and that's what we need up there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Senator McPhedran.
Thanks so much. What is your sense? You've just talked about a very successful program. A lot of the testimony that we receive here gives us very inspiring examples with excellent results, and then we find out that they've been shut down. What is your sense of why that happened with this very successful program?
Well, as you know, the province of Saskatchewan is going through some difficult times economically. We're not doing well at all. Part of the reason the reason given by our government, by the provincial government, was that they needed to cut administration costs. And this is something I was very actively, and I was a community organizer. I worked with the student council, I worked with teachers and advocating and fighting for NORTEP, participating in sit-ins, participating in protests. But that only saved $500,000. And the program is still alive. They opened up they made a calling, I guess. So all the other post-secondary institutions in the province were able to put a bid in or an application in to kind of amalgamate with this program. And the one that got it didn't even actually put an application in. But so I don't know what happened there. But really just to cut administrative costs down, and that was about $500,000 in savings, kind of a drop in the bucket, if you ask me.
Sorry, I just need to be clear with the answer. So then are you saying that even though there is a vestige of this program continuing, the heart of the program that was producing the excellent results is gone?
Yes, the things that made NORTEP special no longer exist. The tuition was paid for with a new organization that has it now. That's not happening. The books were paid for. They're no longer paid for by this new organization. And NORTEP had excellent housing. If you had children and you lived in the far north, school is very difficult. It's very difficult to afford to move from, let's say, like Wollaston, for instance, all the way down to Saskatoon, support yourself, support your kids. NORTEP could almost guarantee you a spot. And also, I forgot to mention they had bursaries too. I think it was $700 a month, and that really helped the students make it through those cold winters that we have.
Senator Patterson, you had a quick question.
Well, it's not an easy question, but I would like you to share a bit of your experience with working with the kids following the tragedies there. What drives such young kids to despair, and were you able to help? What do they need?
That's a great question. What drives them to despair? Nobody really knows. We have an idea, but could we actually ever put our finger right down on it and say this is the problem? It's a lot of things. It's poverty, it's addictions, it's sometimes it's even a social thing. Suicide pacts are common. They do happen. But working with those kids, never in my life have I met such amazing, resilient, smart, kind, courageous youth. They are amazing youth that I work with, and we didn't necessarily force the conversation of bullying or suicide, but we let them come to us, and we just try to bring positivity to the situation. It can be through hand games, it can be through a New Year's Eve dry dance, it can be through traditional teachings. That's essentially, what we do. And my experience as a youth worker.
Thank you. Senators, we will now suspend for 5 minutes. We will, during the break, we will have an official photograph taken with the youth representatives and with the senators. Thank you. So we'll suspend for 5 minutes. And we continue with the next 4 youth leaders on our special evening tonight. And first up, we have Jacquelyn Cardinal. Jacquelyn, you have the floor.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I prepared a statement just to try and make the most out of my time here. I traveled all the way from Edmonton, so I bring greetings today from Treaty 6 territory, the lands on which I live today and am a guest, as well as from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation on Treaty 8 territory, which is the traditional home of my people, the Sakwa-Winawak. I thank you for having me here today as a voice of Indigenous youth and of the future, speaking to the topic that has brought us all together. How can we imagine this new relationship between Canada and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, which, from my vantage point as a young person, is one of the most important questions facing all Canadians today. I'd like to begin first by acknowledging that we are gathering today on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. This is a very special place with deep roots, and I'm thankful and really humbled to be here. So not long ago, I received a teaching about the story of creation and how it is based on the idea of misoa, or infinity, that by definition, the creation of our world has never stopped, and that we are all a part of it, even now. That everyone, including myself, exists in an unbroken chain with all those who came before us and with all those yet to arrive. As an Indigenous youth who grew up in the city, like so many Indigenous youth do these days, receiving this teaching was as if I had been given 2 things that I had been craving all my life without realizing it. One, a reminder that though I walk on the concrete of the city of Edmonton, far from my traditional lands and long after many of my people have gone on to the other side, and that many of my people who are left behind now are walking wounded, I am not alone. And 2, a call to action, because with that belonging, that understanding, that strength, comes a responsibility of carrying on the vision of my ancestors, as well as preparing for my descendants. So now I have what I'm sure is a natural question for someone at the age of 26. What do I do with that? So to answer this question in front of me, I look behind me. Since time immemorial, my people have been governed by our natural law, Wakotowin. In English, it means relationship. Our elders saw the vital importance of maintaining a healthy and prosperous relationship with our way of life, self, community, and environment. And they used Wakotowin as a major guiding principle for maintaining a coexistence, allowing them to thrive. Our relatives out east used a similar guiding principle, the Tura Wampum Belt. This is known as one of the oldest agreements made between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations. And this was represented by 2 rows of purple beads signaling the courses of 2 vessels, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, traveling down the river of life together, parallel but never touching, in mutual respect and sovereignty. My ancestor, Mustas, a key leader during the negotiations of Treaty 8, applied his understanding of Wokotowin in his time as well. He famously said, "I see the white man coming in, and I want to be friends. I see what he does, but it is best that we should be friends." We are all treaty people, and we all have responsibilities to maintain our Wokotowin with each other. In implementing that idea, my brother and business partner, Hunter Cardinal, and I have embarked on creating, as part of our corporate social responsibility for our company, Kootenhayoo, is what we're calling treaty projects. So these projects are our opportunity to fulfill our obligations as Canadians and treaty people through applying ancient governance principles to our systems today in order to restore, regenerate, and reinvigorate what has been damaged. This is how we build the future: parallel, sustainable, and healthy relationship with our non-Indigenous partners. So this resurgence of an older connectedness and specific parallel relationship is important in understanding our future as Indigenous and non-Indigenous treaty people. There are two entities that are in relationship, and in order for that relationship to be vitalized and as authentic as it can be, we need to ensure that we are allowing the other entity to be vitalized through their own recognition of their separate self, their values, and their culture. Through self-recognition and a celebration of that uniqueness, we find strength and a capacity to ensure our relationship goes forward in prosperity and perpetuity. As Bell Hooks points out, we need to stop being so preoccupied with looking to that other for recognition. Instead, we should be recognizing ourselves and then seeking to make contact with all those who would engage us in a constructive manner. These treaty projects, like all our work at Kootenhayoo, starts with an assets-based approach. So we look at what we already have in terms of knowledge, skills, and lived experience and go from there. So as the owner and operator of a digital marketing and engagement agency, my skills are in communications and technology. I have trained in modular design, systems thinking, and user experience principles, as well as programming and graphic design. And I have the great privilege of having been born with a natural affinity and love of technology and the opportunity to explore it. Coupled with my brother's honed skills as an artist and an actor in deep empathy and pursuit of truth, our skill sets combine to not only provide our client base with unique digital services that enables us to pay our expenses, but to invest surplus time and resources to see, think, organize, and act on what we believe our obligations are, not only as Indigenous peoples in a pivotal time in our history, but as treaty people in a pivotal time in Canadian and world history. To illustrate this, I would like to give an overview of one of the treaty projects that we are actively developing at this time, which Senator Sinclair mentioned during our visit to the Senate chambers this afternoon. I had the amazing opportunity to visit the Oceti Shikoe camp at Standing Rock last December, and I was impacted deeply from that experience, but what struck me the deepest was the way that the Standing Rock Sioux accepted the allies that arrived, took mindful steps to teach us enough to help us respect their traditions, and then gave us work to do. Many people remarked that you couldn't actually understand what the entire movement was about unless you had worked in the kitchens. So the Sioux made clear to all of us allies that had arrived that this was their struggle, but that they would create a place where we could help them. When I came home, my brother and I developed an initiative called Tatuao, which means welcome, there is room in Cree, and seeks to do exactly that in everyday life. Welcome all of us in, Indigenous, settlers, and newcomers alike, and provide information and encouragement to learn so that everyone can move forward together in Wokotowin and provide practical jobs for our allies to do, to provide a rallying point. We have been humbled from the response from our community, who have taken this idea and run with it, demonstrating an enthusiasm and deep sense of ownership by Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples alike across industries. Success with Tatuao has inspired us to develop other initiatives, ranging from improving Indigenous peoples' presence in the tech sector to creating podcast series that share the stories of other Indigenous peoples and allies about how they meet the challenges of our time, as well as others. So what is this new relationship? We believe that the way forward is not necessarily in creating something wholly new, but in reinvigorating the original spirit of the peace and friendship agreed upon during the negotiation of our treaties, and using all tools available to help us get there. When we do this, we will become the Canada we were always meant to be, side by side. And if I were to make one ask of all those gathered here today, it would be to please take steps to support grassroots community initiatives that come from a place of encouraging recognition and engagement with who we are as treaty people and our obligations to ourselves, community, and environment. And if I were to make a second, it would be to encourage us all to remind ourselves and those who surround us that we are all a part of Misoa, or infinity, and that each of us is powerful, important, and hold a unique role in the continued great unfolding of our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacquelyn. Senator Tait, to be followed by Senator Tanis.
Thank you very much. If you had another ask, what would it be?
Honestly, probably more funding towards actually increasing, again, Indigenous people's presence in the tech sector. As a woman in the tech sector, that's already a struggle. As an Indigenous woman in the tech sector, I typically am the only Indigenous person I come across. The tech sector is the fastest growing sector in the Canadian economy, and it's something that is actually in line with when you seek out these trades. They are very much like any other trade. It's very much like welding or anything like that. It takes a very short amount of time, and you can immediately be of use. And in one of our initiatives, which I mentioned briefly, it's actually an alliance of technical colleges, agencies in our city, and tech companies who are really inspired by the idea of not only kind of finding untapped labor resources locally, which is a really big problem, but also by injecting a really interesting perspective that Indigenous people will be able to bring to the table whenever we're approaching any problem. Because as you know, in the creative industry, which is what tech really is, as we're solving problems, is the more perspectives you have at the table, the better solution you will get. So we're missing, we're having a lot of seats that are empty at this particular table, and it's important not only to, develop a diverse economy, but also to really make sure that we're solving these problems the best we can.
Excellent.
One quick one?
Yes, sorry. You inspired me to ask that question. The question I wanted to ask you, because it was really exciting to hear what you were describing, is if you were designing some tech support, and I'm a techno-twit, so bear in mind, what would you do? How would you invigorate this process, the nation-to-nation process that this committee is involved with and that the Senate is involved with?
With utilizing technology? Mm-hmm. See, and this is where, my roots show as an Indigenous person, I think, because on the surface I'm very much, a technophile, and, I'm really into that stuff. But at the base of things, I really believe that modern technology is really like any other tool. It's a new tool that can be used for bad, it can be used for good. I think we see a lot of both. And I think that we need to not only understand that there is a downside, but that understand that, we haven't really utilized these tools yet in a good way. So I mean, it's a fairly tough question, but it's interesting to be able to look at, the landscape, be able to really imagine, because I'm steeped in this industry every day, be able to actually really fully imagine what the world is going to be like in 10 years and be like, oh, we are not ready yet. And there's so much promise if we can prepare, if we can, like Wayne Gretzky, go to where the puck is going, as opposed to, really get ready for it staying there despite we know that it's moving. So, yeah.
Thank you. Senator Tanis.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Jacquelyn. I'm from Alberta as well, from southern Alberta. And I want to ask you something that I guess as we try and figure out what the future looks like, and that's what we're asking, right? And the reason for this is that we're trying to say, if we can get the future clear enough, we know where we are. Mm-hmm. We can start to figure out how to build and what needs to happen in order to get to the future.
Yes.
And one of the things that is not clear for me that I'd like to ask you, especially because you come from a creative business but also a very logical business, is how in the future, in the perfect future, how does Indigenous government, a new, fully funded, powered Indigenous government, touch you and your descendants, and as you say, people like you that are continuing to move to metropolitan markets or metropolitan settlements, and not assimilate, but integrate within that environment? Mm-hmm. How do you see that government touching you and your children? Mm-hmm. Specifically, what would they have governance on you for? What would you be looking to them to provide?
I mean, that's really tough. I mean, first off, I'd like to just say, too, that Edmonton is actually situated on an area that was known as the Pehonan, or the waiting place. So there have been people and my ancestors gathering there forever. So really, we've always been there, and it's actually natural for us to be in that space. So that being said, I mean, it's really tough to fully imagine the future. And I actually think that what's really helpful for me when I'm thinking of solving any problems, because you're totally correct, it is a very creative industry as well as logical. And the unfortunate thing is that in both, even though design is about solving problems and art is about asking new ones, when you think about solving problems in general, you kind of have to take your tools and your processes and hold on to them and just be like, meh, and just kind of go into the abyss with them. I feel like if we take these tools of, consultation, of building relationships, of these really old ideas based in treaty, then we can move forward in a good way and then get to a future that we will be prepared for because we left in a good way in the right direction. And I mean, like, I have very little patience. I mean, even for a young person, I like things now. So I like to know where I'm going and when I'm going to get there, and if I'm going to have time to like have a snack and that kind of stuff. But I really think that it's important to be able to, trust in the fact that as well that I really believe in the 7 generations idea and thinking, and that any future that we'd really be moving towards is not something I'll ever see. And I always I put my stock into making sure that I'm making good decisions now to be able to make that actually happen in the future.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So you will conduct yourself as you will conduct yourself, and the future will unfold as it should. Is that?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and that sounds like weirdly optimistic even for me, but that being said, I really believe in it as well in the future of how a future government will actually interact with us. I mean, I do think a lot of it lies in technology. I think that it's really interesting, especially in my industry, as I see how I build my company, that Indigenous governance principles actually find themselves by different names. So like, rotational leadership models of like what would happen if you would go on a hunt, how you would actually organize is actually agile methodologies in the tech industry, or flat hierarchies. So it's kind of fascinating seeing that happen. Yeah, so I don't know if I really answered your question, but yeah, I think that when you actually see a bit of a return to these old ways of imagining and of organizing ourselves. So I think it's going to look pretty similar to how it used to be, kind of returning to smaller groups of people, somehow utilizing the technologies that we have to be able to do that. Yeah, so it'll be interesting at the very least. I'm excited.
Thank you.
Senator Christmas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think my question is still percolating, so just bear with me for a minute. I find you very interesting that you have embraced technology, and yet you are firmly rooted in your culture, in your tradition, and your old teachings. As we struggle as senators to try to find what that nation-to-nation relationship will look like, one thing that we have overlooked, and you have reminded me and reminded us today, that to achieve that is we have to understand the roots of Indigenous people, that it is based on Indigenous law. And you called it Wikotuan?
Yes.
And I think my question is, if Canadians were able to understand how Indigenous people respect and honor their laws, their ancient laws that have been here for, who knows, centuries and centuries.
Yeah.
I think my question is, how important do you think the natural law of Indigenous people is when it comes to reestablishing that nation-to-nation relationship?
Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I studied science in school, so I'm a really big fan of reasoning from first principles. And I think that instead of analogously. So you think about things, you go back to what you know to be true, and then you reason from there, as opposed to being like, well, this worked here, so it will probably work here. testing it that way. So I think that if you're looking at how to solve the contemporary issue, returning back to these, these base principles of Indigenous, ways of building relationship and Indigenous natural law, I think it's a fantastic place to start. So it's kind of, again, the frustrating thing of returning back to these very basic ideas. But what I think is fascinating, it really shows the wisdom of our ancestors, is that these laws apply no matter the time and no matter what happens. Like they're guiding principles that apply no matter the actual dynamic environment that it's being put upon. So it's relevant always, which is great because now I don't have to think as much. So.
And if I may, Madam Chair, I think the beauty of that is that we're uncovering an ancient wisdom. And it's not as if, and the Mi'kmaq had the same belief, that we also envisioned a world where non-Indigenous people would be part of it. And so this Indigenous law, I think, in my mind, is the key to developing or becoming the basis of that nation-to-nation concept. Yeah. So that's not a question, but well, I'm thinking as I'm talking. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I'm sure I'm eating to everybody's time, but what I think is really fascinating, especially about the treaty projects that we're doing, is that it's not me and my brother and our Indigenous friends really pushing it forward all on our own. Our allies want to be given jobs. They want to know about these natural laws that come from the place that they live. They feel untethered, and there's no reason why, in my mind, that if we tell them our stories and they respect them and they wish to engage with us in a respectful way, that can't happen. And I see, again, I referred to Standing Rock in my statement. That shows people are willing to just show up. And it's enough for them to show up in my book, and that's when you start to build relationship. I think that's how I like to think about allies.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, great. Thank you, Jacquelyn. We'll now move on to Tiffany Monkman. Okay, Tiffany, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. It's something I'm not used to, as I'm usually in the position of nominating one of my students. I'm a Métis woman born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba. My father grew up in Stony Point, Manitoba. My mother grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and my parents just celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary. I have one younger brother, TJ, who I'll speak about later. My parents did have some financial challenges throughout our lives, but my parents made sure my brother and me were able to do at least one thing we loved, which for me was competitive swimming. I swam for 15 years, 6 of them with the University of Manitoba Bison swim team. My parents always identified as Métis, but never taught me anything about our culture, because for my parents growing up, it was taboo to talk about or even acknowledge you were Métis. But we've always appreciated who we are. My first awareness of my culture was at the 2002 North American Indigenous Games, where I competed in the sport of swimming. I remember standing on the pool deck and only seeing Indigenous people in the lanes next to me and in the stands. I felt so connected with everyone around me. I felt a calmness and safeness that is sometimes unexplainable to others. I was the first in my family to get a university degree, and I credit Aboriginal business education partners, whom I work with today, for helping me and encouraging me to get through and graduate with my Bachelor of Commerce, and for helping me become more aware of my Métis roots. I have never felt such a connection and safety around people until I was interacting with people of my culture. I speak about sport here today and in my bio, but it has shaped me into who I am today. Sport isn't just a physical activity, it teaches individuals life lessons, and I bring that with me every time I speak and present with Indigenous youth. Now I want to touch on my brother TJ. My brother struggled a bit to find his passion after high school, but one business course in college and a conversation with me put him on the road to a business degree. He graduated last year from the Asper School of Business and is now working in the accounting field, and I couldn't be more proud. University was very difficult for me, but knowing it helped my younger brother brings me so much joy. I bring this story with me when I present to high school Indigenous students, as they may one day inspire a younger sibling or family member. It makes me so proud when I get to see one of my students graduate, or when I see an Indigenous youth become comfortable enough around me to show me their work. It makes me even more proud when a youth comes to university and many not know much about their culture, but thanks to the University of Manitoba, students have the ability to learn about their culture. In 2016, I was able to host a mock university class with an Asper School of Business professor, where high school Indigenous students from the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative attended. It was an honor to be able to provide an opportunity like this to these students. The University of Manitoba took notice that a large portion of self-declared Indigenous students at the U of M are Métis, so a group of us have come together to discuss ideas to better support Métis students. The University of Manitoba and the Asper School of Business has grown so much over the past years welcoming the Indigenous community, and I couldn't be more prouder to be working with this organization. Now, when it comes to the study of the new relationship between Canada and Indigenous people, one thing really stood out for me. We want to talk to people who are affected. Great things can come from this, such as 1, allow Indigenous people to feel welcomed and appreciated, and 2, for other cultures to understand how to appreciate and interact with Indigenous people. I want to tell you a story about a time I took the bus home from work. I saw an Indigenous woman get on the bus, and she started asking people where she should get off to reach her destination. And person after person ignored her and gave her unfortunate looks. She then moved to the other side of the bus where I was, and I leaned into her and said, "Miss, you can get off at the second stop and you'll reach your location." She then looked at me with the kindest eyes and said, "You know, you're the only person who's ever had a conversation with me on the bus." My heart dropped. Still to this day, Indigenous people have to deal with this day in and day out, and it needs to stop. This new study has the ability to give Indigenous people the necessary platforms to speak and have roundtables, is the one example. There is one thing I would recommend, which is to go to the Indigenous people's communities as well. To be able to open their relationship with inviting them to Ottawa is great, but being able for them to share their stories on their land and their communities would make them feel that much more comfortable. You have to remember they are part of this relationship, and Canada should partake in Indigenous traditions of how they share stories. I know this study is going to give the chance for Canada to understand to get information that they need, but this is a huge time for Indigenous people as well, because it takes enormous strength for one to share their story, especially when there is trauma in it. For them to open up about what happened to them is an extremely significant step, and I'd like Canada to honor this and be extremely respectful. I have not only experienced one trauma, but I have experienced 2 traumatic events in my life, and some days are extremely difficult dealing with triggers. I can't imagine how difficult it is dealing with decades of trauma, how bad a trigger can be for an Indigenous individual. I know some Canadians ask, what can we do to help? I reply with this. Yes, we do not understand what it feels like to be in a residential school, but I'm going to sit here and listen because each and every one who has been affected deserves to be heard. When these roundtables do happen, I recommend there be some sort of way for participants to decompress afterwards, whether there be therapists or counselors on hand, because it can take a toll on someone to share their story. The reason why this section of the study sticks out for me is that this is the goal I want Canada to focus on, to hear Indigenous people. Throughout my career working with Indigenous people in the financial industry and academia, I found a common theme. They want to be heard and understood. These people have experienced trauma, and their fight or flight response is easily activated. So I ensure to show them I am here to be with them, not dictate to them. When I left the bank to move on to working at the university, my clients thanked me for being an understanding banker. This is where I started to recognize I am interested in how to adopt to one's communication style, especially people in my culture. Everyone wants to make a difference, and I have found my one difference: to help Indigenous youth find their passion. Doing something small each day can be exactly what Canada needs. Be that person who speaks to the Indigenous woman on the bus, I did, and it forever changed my life. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Tiffany. Senator Martin, you have a question?
Thank you, Tiffany. And I missed the first part. I'm not a regular member, but I just feel from like hearing you and the previous witness just how much wealth of information and passion you're bringing to the table. So I want to thank the committee for undertaking this study, as well as the Senate communications and what has happened throughout the day. So you said a few things that kind of make me want to ask you more and find out more. So when you talk about how sport was such an important, anchor or, just a part of your identity, and that helped you in just face all of the challenges in life, are there Indigenous sports that could be perhaps, maybe it already is happening, but are there Indigenous games, like just the kind of on a national level or regional levels that would also be inviting to non-Indigenous people and to really showcase the real athleticism as well as the culture?
Mm-hmm. So I just mentioned it quickly that there is, they try to have it every 4 years, the North American Indigenous Games. I attended back in 2002, but they're going to have it this summer as well. And when I first attended in 2002, it was, I was extremely shocked as to how Indigenous people came together to celebrate one's passion, whether it be swimming or volleyball or basketball. It was just really, I felt extremely honored that people in my culture really appreciate what people's passions are, and when they come together. I know one sport, and my younger brother did the sport, lacrosse, and I really hope that that sport does get more of national attention, just because of the Indigenous roots with it. So those two things kind of stick out for me for growing up.
Right, and I was also really identifying with you talking about just really owning your identity, and that's a very important foundation for just one's own pride and sense of belonging. So in terms of the really proud history of the Indigenous people, do you think there's a way to really ensure that like some of the real golden nuggets of information are better known by the Indigenous youth and people themselves, as well as to Canadians? Do you think that would be a very important part of just the nation-to-nation building, to really understand the history from which you come?
Mm-hmm, for sure. When people, it's just hearing the certain things that people don't know about the Indigenous culture, it'd be really nice, and I hope this goes forward, is before the negativity happened, Indigenous culture is so beautiful, and they're so family-oriented, and what I try to do, and for me it's just small steps. If I have a conversation or I bring in other people on the university or alumni to talk to Indigenous youth, because what I find is, and for me, I connect more, and it really resonates with me more when I hear someone share their story. So as many stories that I can get to Indigenous youth when I invite them onto campus or when I go visit them at high schools, I make sure to share them with some sort of kind of story. And that's when I really see them open up and kind of become more comfortable. And whether we're working on some sort of project, they become that more, I guess, fascinated with it when they know that there's a connection there.
Mm-hmm. And I really just want to say the sharing of the stories, beautiful, painful, powerful, all of them, that's very important. So I think you really hit on one of the key objectives of creating this real relationship, is to really share those stories and let it be known. So thank you so much for sharing yours.
Thank you.
Senator McPhedran.
Hi, Tiffany. I'm glad we had a chance to talk in the pub last night.
Yes.
And to see you in this more formal setting. Now, you have shared with us that you were born and raised in Winnipeg. I mean, I was born and raised in rural Manitoba, so I actually don't know the city of Winnipeg that well, but I wanted to ask you a question around my impression, having lived in the city now for the past 8 years. And that is to say that my impression is that it is a dramatically divided city. That the north-south divide, I live on the north side, and the north side is generally considered to be the poor side. It is generally considered to be where there is the concentration of Indigenous peoples living, urban Indigenous peoples living on the north side. And I just wanted to ask whether your sense of having been born and raised in Winnipeg, whether as a young leader you are seeing any significant changes or shifts in the city and in the division of the city, and if so, if you are seeing something positive that's more recent, how would you suggest building on that?
Okay, so to start it off, I was getting a ride from my friend who lives in the south end of Winnipeg, and I was getting a ride back with her brother back to, I live in the north side of Winnipeg, and he's never been past downtown. Right. So everything past downtown for him was scary. And it was a complete shock because I'm like, you live in Winnipeg, like there's more than just the south side. So that was 5+ years ago. And now, comparing that to this, what I'm about to say is working at the Asper School of Business, where it is in the South End, and a lot of the students who live in the South End attend the Asper School of Business. And I've seen so much, it's baby steps, but it's growth, which I like to see. There's professors that are incorporating Indigenous content into their courses that they teach. One of the student associations have put on an Indigenous seat into their council, and our students have been working years and years to put that on there. Our dean has been doing amazing work asking us what can we do. So he agreed to host a Indigenous workshop at the Asper School of Business for faculty and staff. And my students were able to speak on behalf of how it is to be an Indigenous student in the Asper School of Business. And it was just, it's really great to see, yes, it's baby steps, but there's growth going on there. So for me, it's very proud to be working in that area. And moving forward, I think it's just making sure to keep on pushing the limits, I guess you could say. It was very uncomfortable. You have to have uncomfortable conversations with people that don't want to listen to you. And just seeing how proud I am of my students to keep pushing, things are happening. It's not as fast as we want it to be, but it's moving that way. So I think it's just having those uncomfortable conversations with people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. We'll now move on to our next youth leader, Andrea Andersen. Oh, there you go. Looks like you're grounded.
Yes. So, atali hai ulukut atiga Andrea Andersen, imi inuvunga ama makovi miunguvunga nuat sabut ulumi kuviasuvunga. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. To the Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, of the Senate, we are here for one reason today, and that is to discuss this new relationship between the Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. First, I would like to applaud your reasoning for the naming of the study, as noted again that not all Indigenous groups identify as a nation. So when the government states this new nation-to-nation relationship, it does not identify to me as an Inuk. And second, youth are excited. So this is the first time that the government is creating this new relationship, and you are asking for youth input. It is definitely in the direction of where we need to go. When you take a look around this room, each person comes from a different background, whether it's a different Indigenous origin or being an ally. But we are here for one thing today, to help guide and bring a youthful voice to this topic. You have a year and a half left to tackle the remainder of this study. I don't want to put any pressure, but I am very honored to share my thoughts with you today. I want to be very careful in what I say to you, as many of the urgent topics that myself and many of us have noted to be important have already been highlighted last year, especially in regards to language retention, economic development, suicide prevention, creating mediums and platforms to express our ideas, and also the housing crisis in the North. I am a physiotherapist by profession, so after the session tonight, I'll be doing some assessments over in this corner. But growing up in my community, it's a isolated Inuit community in northern parts of Labrador. I was known as the little girl who sat on every committee. Because I was bored, so I wanted to do something. There wasn't much to do growing up. And today I represent urban Indigenous youth through the Friendship Centre movement. So the Friendship Centre movement is Canada's most significant off-reserve Indigenous service delivery infrastructure. So there's 118 centres across Canada, and each centre is the primary provider of culturally enhanced programs and services to urban Indigenous people. We facilitate the transition of people from rural, remote, and reserve life to an urban environment. For many people, we are the first point of contact, either to obtain referrals for culturally based socioeconomic programs or services. I would like to spread light to the committee in regards to Part C of the study on what areas that the committee should look into. I know you're only in Part A, but I want to get you started thinking of what will need to come. So the first thing, there's three things that I would like to address. The first is the relationship with the federal government and current Indigenous organizations. So for example, the National Association of Friendship Centre. Friendship Centres have a well-known history in Canada. We have been around for 60 years, and we provide many of the same services as what you will find in either a land claim settlement area or on reserve. It is known that more Indigenous people are moving from rural areas to urban centers for various reasons. And we help these people with this transition. However, in the government's eyes, we are not treated the same as other Indigenous organizations like AFN or ITK. We always get the recognition of the wonderful work that we do, but recognition is not what we need. We need more support. We have a huge growing demand, yet we do not receive any infrastructure funding to meet this demand. It is very hard to service your people when the facilities that we provide these programs out of cannot upkeep with the growing numbers. The National Association of Friendship Centres and the Friendship Centre movement is a grassroots movement. So we have an open door policy. We do not just service First Nations or Inuit or Métis. We service all Indigenous groups, and we provide that cultural programming to all of them. So we would like to have the same access to funding resources as the other groups. The second thing that I would like to touch base on is how natural resources are developed on our lands going forward in the future. I know the Senate has completed a study in the past around this topic, but I think it needs to be touched on in this study as well. Now, we're not fully anti-development, but when our resources are taken from our areas, it needs to be done in a way that is with Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, and the Indigenous people need to benefit, and the region that it is on need to benefit as well. And you also have to make sure that the environment is protected while doing so. So I like to use examples, and I want to give a current example of how this is currently not the case. Labrador, Nalcor, and Muskrat Falls. So there is a 6-year opposition with the Inuit and the Innu of Labrador, where the federal and provincial government have failed to support these Indigenous groups. I'll give you some background information. Nalcor is a provincial crown energy corporation in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. One of its businesses is the Lower Churchill Project, which will produce hydroelectric energy. One of their installments is Muskrat Falls. This project is a complete mess, and it does make me angry. I need you to understand that it is 2017, and from this project, in just the past month, not something that's happened 6 months ago, but in this past month, we've had a Labrador community evacuated due to flooding from this hydroelectric project, and we have a Inuk grandmother by the name of Beatrice Hunter. She is placed in a men's correctional facility in St. John's, now ongoing 10 days. She has her hearing on this upcoming Friday. But political leaders in our province are saying they cannot intervene with the justice system. And this is because she stated to the Supreme Court that she might not be able to stay 1 kilometer away from the Muskrat Falls site. So how is this creating a better relationship with Indigenous people? You are putting people in jail and having these communities evacuated. When this project started, there was no community consultations, no consultations with Indigenous leaders. Until recently this fall, 3 people had to go on a hunger strike before even the provincial government decided to actually listen to the people of Labrador and to know that we were actually concerned about this project. Canada is so rich in its natural resources, but if it were up to the Indigenous people of any part of Canada, I don't think we would have these corporations in our backyard, preventing our animals to grow and practicing our rights to live on our land. It just would not pass. But unfortunately, we have no say in what happens. And even if we do, it's a real hard fight to prove so. So with this new relationship, we need to strongly push that any natural resource project, whether it's in a land claims agreement area or not, have the following things put in place. So the first is an in-depth community consultation that is recorded and followed up on before any prospecting or even touching the land even begins. And then having regular follow-up community sessions where locals can actually express their concerns. Then the second is hiring locals not only to do the labor work, but also be the managers and higher up personnel. And then if there's no local workers in the education field that is needed, don't start the project until you educate those local Indigenous people to take those roles. And then the last thing is to have independent review boards and researchers who monitor and provide up-to-date data and analysis of these projects. These corporations need to be held accountable for coming onto our Indigenous lands, and this needs to be included in our new partnership. Now, the last thing that I would like to address is who our leaders actually represent. I come from a province, so I currently live in Nunavut, but I have grown up in Newfoundland and Labrador, and currently, over the past 3 years, our Premier is also the Minister responsible for Labrador and Aboriginal Affairs. This person has been responsible for Indigenous issues for 3 years. He is the only minister in the province who has not shown his face in my Nunatsiavut region. He has never grown up in this area, nor is Indigenous. And I want to give an example of this. Nalcor is destroying Indigenous lands in Labrador, preventing Inuit and Innu from hunting on their traditional territory. However, the leader of the government who is supposed to address these issues is the same person who leads our province. The province that, technically speaking, owns the company that is in so much conflict with Indigenous groups. So I urge that in leading forward that it be addressed that no political representation of Indigenous issues be the sole leader of a province. So for these points, I would like for you to remember that Friendship Centers should be given the same opportunity for funding as other friendship centers, as we provide many of the same program and services that other Indigenous organizations receive. We are just in an urban setting. Second, that natural resource corporations need to have community consultations and local approval before any project is started. And the third is Indigenous portfolio should be held by Indigenous people who come from that area and not be the sole leader of that province. I hope my comments have sparked some areas or created more proof for others that you might have already addressed. I do have a question for you. I noticed that Senator Dick stated in December of last year that this newly formed relationship will all depend on the group that we are currently addressing, as not all Indigenous groups are not equal, but the same. So I'm just wondering, will there be a bilateral agreement or some type, like what will the agreements have to be put in place for each Indigenous group? What will they look like? And how will this be implemented in the future government? And as Ms. Adamique stated last year, that there needs to be more opportunity for space for these types of discussions to happen. And I thank you for creating this space today. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Huyanamik.
Thank you, Andrea. The first question from Senator Patterson.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for obviously a very well thought out, well prepared presentation with some real concrete advice. You know, I'd like to ask you, do you think that if the Muskrat Falls project if it had followed the four principles that you mentioned are necessary, do you think there's a chance that the developers might have won support from the Inuit? Because I understand the Innu did reach some kind of an agreement, and it's the Inuit that your community that are really feeling more left out. Might it have been possible to work out a win-win scenario there, do you think? And I wonder, there's a big project in Nunatavut, the Voisey's Bay mine. Would you have any comments about how that's working and whether there's more success in engaging or employing Inuit of Nunatavut in the heart of their lands in Nain?
Mm-hmm. So when any type of natural resource corporation go on Indigenous lands, there's always a talk of an impacts benefit agreement. Nalcor was smart in this decision because the Muskrat Falls project technically is only on Innu lands. So they created the New Dawn Agreement, which is an impact benefits agreement between the Innu Nation and Nalcor and the provincial government. However, the Inuit have rights to their land claim area. However, the Muskrat Falls site is outside of this land claim area. Inuit occupy the land, but they don't have any say because it's more Innu territory. The things that are concerning now for the community, the Inuit communities that are affected, is pretty much a few things that of the other youth that spoke today around natural resource development is the impacts that it's having on communities around road infrastructure. I know Happy Valley Goose Bay is their community council is having to spend more funds repairing roads because of the heavy equipment that's going over the roads on a daily basis. The congestion of busing people in from work, it's slowed down the day-to-day life of the community itself. And there is no response planning happening between the corporation and those communities. So Nalcor's only responsibility is if the dam breaks or gives away, is to just call the community town and say, oh, the dam gave away. They are not. They are stated that they are not responsible for any funding or anything that way to actually help in emergency response planning. So when the community of Mud Lake got evacuated last month, Nalcor didn't have to pay a cent of that, even though they lifted some of the, they raised the water level because they lifted some of the doors of the dam. And so in regards to that, those communities, I think they just want to be heard. They want to understand what's happening. There is no communication of saying, this is what we're doing, what do you think of it, and how can we go from there? Because they just came in and did what they said they were going to do. There was no input, and I think you need to have that communication for everyone to be on the same page. In regards to the Voisey's Bay mines, it's different because it is in the Inuit, the Nunatsiavut government land claim area, so Inuit have more control over that area. So they have their hiring processes put in place, they have the scholarships for the youth, and they have many, many training opportunities for young people to go in and to look at the mines. They have training opportunities for people to go and get employment in the area, and they, I think, are a very good example of how a project, like a natural resource project, should be done. They worked with the Inuits on how to, for example, there's a vessel that goes up every year, so it breaks up the ice, and the Inuit can no longer cross that ice floe. So what they did is they came up with a plan and they create a bridge so now the Inuit can still cross land to go hunting on their traditional territory. So those things, there are many things that need to be set in place, and Voisey's Bay, they've done that because the Inuit leaders made sure it was done. Whereas in Muskrat Falls' case, it's different because it's owned by the government, and they got to the Innu Nation before people actually understood fully what it was going to look like.
Thank you. Senator Sinclair. Thank you. Senator Sinclair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to begin by remarking that for such a little person, you pack a hell of a punch.
Thank you.
And that's meant as a compliment, incidentally. I want you to know that. I listened carefully to what you had to say, particularly around the issue of development and the need for involvement, consultation, and even by implication, I think, in the words that you said, consent. Because if I remember, if I heard you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I heard you say that one of the things that you would want to have in place is that there would be agreements before development actually started.
Yep.
So those agreements imply a consent relationship. So have you seen any of those kinds of things ever happen that you could point to as an example?
Yeah, so Labrador is very rich in natural resources, as the rest of Canada, but I speak to it because that's where I come from. And I have an example. Uranium is really big, and Aurora Energy is a company that tried to do some uranium mining, and before they even did any prospecting, they held community meetings and said, this is what we are expecting to do. What do you think? And they made sure that they had the input from people who worked previously in the mines or prospecting, and then they also made sure that they heard from the youth. So they actually went to the schools and talked to the youth and said, this is what we're thinking of doing. What do you think of that? And then they also made monthly, if not yearly, community visits to each community that would be affected on what they are wanting to do. And then they made sure that everything, like the communication of what they were doing, happened. There wasn't an agreement put in place because you have, as long as they get their, their license to be on the land, then they don't have to have that community consent. So I think there's an opportunity there that whether it's federal or provincial, I'm not sure. So once you obtain or try to get this permit or license to actually prospect, that there has to be a step where you have to do that community consultation first and then get a majority of consensus from the communities that are mostly affected. So I don't know if that's something that could be implemented, but it's an idea.
Just for clarification, is that a company that operates within one of the Inuit land claim settlement areas?
Yes. So it is different because there is a land claims area, so they have to be responsible. And it's a different, say, ball game when you're dealing with other natural resource projects like pipelines and fracking and stuff, because there is no land claim that is preventing people from doing that. So I think having that step in the licensing or application process to have those community consultations before anything is done could be something that should be looked into, because you are then starting that community consultation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Andrea, and I would like to address your question to the committee. Thank you very much for going back in our history and looking at what had transpired when we had the youth leaders here last year. And what I would like to ask you is this: do you think that we should go back and look at their testimony? We did have a smaller number of youth leaders the year before. Do you think it would be a good idea if we went back to those transcripts and import their input into our current study? Because at that time we didn't, that was sort of under a general mandate.
Yep.
So you had a very specific question, and we don't know what we're going to recommend in this study, but so you do think we should go back and import that testimony and make it part of the testimony for this particular study?
I think so, because some of the topics that were addressed, especially suicide prevention and the housing crisis in the north, those are things that also needed to be addressed. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that. And we will now move to our last youth leader this evening, Chris Tait. Yes, you probably need to raise the chair.
Cool. That's better.
Great. Welcome, Chris. You have the floor.
Awesome. So, hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Tait. I'm from Vancouver, BC. Currently, right now, I'm in school, trying to get my full grade 12, as well as I'm working toward becoming and getting in people's faces. Very exciting stuff. As well as I work at a community center working toward developing different projects, initiatives, that kind of thing, looking to build partnerships within the community to help the community be involved into the community center that I work at specifically, and looking at how we can get Aboriginal families involved. It's something I was always pretty passionate about. And it wasn't until I got the call out for the job that I realized that was something I really wanted to do. When I was younger, as it was mentioned from my bio and my nomination, I began public speaking when I was 15, talking about my experience living in foster care. It was a very interesting and I think unorthodox way to get involved. A friend of mine invited me to a conference, and then they invited me to speak and just to talk about some of the things I liked and didn't like about foster care. And I was 15. I wasn't a public speaker by any means, like officially, but I got very excited because it was the first time I was invited to speak about my story. And to speak about my story, to me, was very exciting. I share a lot of times with my friends and people who didn't grow up in care, and my non-Indigenous friends, but never to a mass audience of people who work within the foster care system. So I said yes. I was given an hour, and I basically complained about where I was currently living because I didn't like it. I didn't like the conditions. I didn't like the other people I was living with currently. I was much younger, so I was a little more blunt and just said I didn't like it, and that I believe I was quoted in saying that they suck. And that I talked about how my social worker wasn't answering my calls and that I wasn't being heard. And I mean, next thing I knew, I was then being heard, very much so. And it was a very exciting experience. And yeah, I didn't think I would ever grow a fan base from complaining about my current life situation. But apparently it can happen, which was very exciting. I then got to go and do other public speaking. I kept getting asked to come back, and each time I went back, I tried to add something more because I was still developing my said story in foster care and also developing what it really was that I wanted to look at. And I had a really great mentor and someone who was really helping me with that, to really speak clearly and really speak my truth and not just be a typical sad story of the young Indigenous boy, as we were always calling it. And that I am someone who, since I was very young, was very outspoken. Probably all of my former foster parents would tell you that I talk too much. And now, I get paid to be a public speaker. So, you never know what can happen from humble beginnings. And it was very exciting to see that development over the course of my public speaking era, as I'll call it. And in 2009, I actually won an award for Youth Achievement and Excellence. I didn't really care for it at the time. I was just like, whatever, this is just something that they just want to say, oh, look, we gave him an award. And I didn't really realize how big of a deal that it was at the time. And I met some really cool people after that, kept working. I got invited to be a part of a council that works directly with MCFD, the Ministry of Children and Family Development, working on the Youth Engagement Toolkit and various other projects, developing new brochures, developing sort of a new way the ministry was looking at working with youth, which was very exciting for me because these were always the people I generally, I think, put in a negative light. And it was really exciting to then go to the regional office and then the provincial office and really see how it works and to meet the people behind the scenes. Because a lot of the time within my experience growing up within foster care, I didn't get to meet a lot of the people who maybe were making certain decisions, and then there's the bigger decisions of the funding and where it goes, and then the even bigger and bigger and bigger decisions. And so it was really exciting to see how the system from the top down worked for me. I then went on to win a national award, and that was the first time I ever came to Ottawa, which was very exciting. Yeah, and that to me was a big deal. I was nominated. I was told, thousands of people get nominated, and someone actually from Vancouver the previous year had won, so I had thought, there was no chance, there was no way, and I won. And I remember getting the phone call, and I was actually transitioning out of foster care to being on my own, and I remember I was actually shopping for all of my stuff that I needed to be an adult, and yeah, everyone does it at some point in their life, and it was very exciting for me. And then yeah, I just kept working on sort of developing myself, developing sort of what I want to see changes within the system, certain policy changes. And then sort of where I'm at now, I've been kind of helping with different initiatives that I believe are working toward some of the key things that I value, which is permanency for young people, whether that's through housing, whether that's through a supportive network that they build with unpaid relationships, because a lot of the time when you grow up in care, you meet a lot of people, but unfortunately, it's a lot of paid relationships and people who are put next to you until you turn 19, or at least within BC, I should probably tread softly here, but at least within BC, when you turn 19, you age out of foster care, and you lose a lot of those supports, the financial support, and a lot of people you would think of as your allies. I was fortunate enough that I had a lot of people who were paid support, but then they also wanted to continue after I was 19 because they saw a lot of potential in me. I was very, very lucky. I had a lot of people helping me do, things like getting housing, getting myself a couch and a bed, and just basic things, which really allowed me to then work toward doing other things that I really enjoy doing. Not all of my experience in care was positive. I definitely lived in a lot of homes where it was weird to walk in and they're just surprised that I was Native. Because I would talk to them on the phone, and then I would show up and they're like, oh, we didn't think you were Native. And I was like, cool. I didn't know you were you, so there we go. And there was definitely other things I've talked about. Within doing my presentations and stuff, I didn't want to retread some of the old things I've talked about. Sort of the things I'm looking at developing now for the future would be creating more youth engagement, first at like a local level and then hopefully like a provincial level and then, further and beyond. As well as looking at sort of what are the avenues that Aboriginal people play a part in that. I know for me, when I started learning about statistics and the different numbers within foster care, because I really wanted to do more research and learn more, I'd found out that there was actually a high percentage of Aboriginal children that were in care in BC, even though I think it's only 2% of the population, which was very alarming. And when I really sat down and thought about it, I was like, well, most of the people I had met, most of my mentors, they were Aboriginal, former youth in care who had aged out and became alumni and sort of helped me on my path. And so where am I at now? I'm trying to do a lot of advocacy pieces. I think those are the things that I'm looking toward doing and developing. The current job that I have, the Rise Leader / Program Assistant position, I work at Hastings Community Center. I actually just won a grant to do a photo voice project, which would be looking at, I'm going to call it Picturing Community, and it'll be working with young people from various areas around Vancouver who I'm hoping to recruit personally and then work with and sort of get their perspective of what community looks like to them, because we all have our own perspective of what community looks like to us and what are the things that we see as our community, and then from there just sort of how we can build off that and create more engagement and improving community. Yes, and I'm also trying to develop photography and my own skills with that. I really enjoy doing photography. I feel like it's the best way to get to know somebody, and I also feel like there's a never-ending supply of people who need photography, so that's also great. Questions?
Thank you, Chris. First question goes to Senator Tait.
Thank you, Chris. And it sounds like you and Stephen, we should have do some kind of display next year in conjunction with the event, and all of you who do artistic as well. I think that would be great. So, and I think that we could think of some way to do it with social media, but I'm not technologically proficient, so we'll leave that to others to think. But I'm curious, it sounds like you may have worked with the National Youth in Care Network, was it a conference there that because the kind of advocacy you're doing is some of the work they've done nationally as well.
Yeah, a little bit. It's been very, since I got my new job and other things, I've been very much trying to help in other ways and volunteering and doing other things, but yeah, a little bit, I guess, to answer the question.
Okay. Well, and are there things that you're doing that you could share with us so that we can make sure we're getting that information out across if it's not through some of those national networks?
Sure, like the different advocacy pieces I want to look at, or okay, there's so many. I mean, definitely creating more permanency for youth in care. I think that there's so many times where youth in care are moved a lot, and sometimes it's a crazy number. And I mean, I think 2 is already too many, but I've heard obscene numbers. And when you're moved around a lot, when you don't have a home base, when you don't have a solid foundation, I mean, somewhere to put your feet on, it very much feels like you're never able to focus on the bigger dreams and your bigger aspirations. So that's something I definitely always advocate and talked about since I was 16, actually. I had an unfortunate experience where I had someone approach me and say that they were going to adopt my brothers and they wanted to adopt me, and I was for it, more to be with my brothers than to be adopted. And then it just unfortunately never worked with this person and me. We just had different, what is it the celebrities say, reconcilable differences. And so now I'm trying to really advocate that we build permanency, and there's more ways to build permanency in a young person's life than just getting them adopted. There's creating more housing options for them. There's building a support network around them that really allows them to do other things, like become tech moguls, or go to university, or to do various number of things. And I've been trying to research more about what are other avenues that people could pursue, like traits and other options as well. There's also, I've been kind of trying to research a little bit around the aged out number of aging out at 19 and what it would look like if it was a different number or support went past 19, those kind of things. I don't want to bore you to death. There's so many pieces, but those definitely I would say they're the top two.
Great, thank you. And have you done any research or work or advocacy around the interconnection between the number of young people, particularly Indigenous young people, who end up in the care of the state and then almost like pushed right into prisons and?
Not too much personally, but I've definitely been connected with various organizations and other people who are doing that work, and still learning, you know. And I feel like it's very, very important because it's a huge number of youth, in particular in BC right now, who are actually aging out and like becoming homeless, and then it leads back to things like addictions and suicide, and a lot of the time it seems like the media is like turning to me to get my quote on it. I'm like, well, you shouldn't be asking me, you should be asking people in that community. In a lot of ways, I think I just speak to my personal story. I can't comment on this thing. So I think for me, still learning a lot about it, and was very shocked to hear some of the numbers and stats, and it was really appalling.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you. We have 3 senators on the list, and we actually are out of time, so if you could ask short questions, please. Senator McPhedran, to be followed by Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris, this picks up actually pretty much where you left off responding to Senator Pate's question, and it is to acknowledge that in the research that is available to us about sex trafficking in Canada, we have a hugely disproportionate percentage of Aboriginal youth who are the targets of sex traffickers. And clearly you've seen a lot, and you spoke specifically to aging out. So here's my question. Would you make a connection between aging out and vulnerability to sex trafficking?
I definitely think there's a connection. Just having experienced aging out and it just being very abrupt. You age so fast. And then, just feeling like, okay, now I'm my own person. I can call this person and this person, and just that's it. I was fortunate enough that so many people wanted to stay involved because when I was younger, I had just a lot of momentum and endless possibility of things I could do. So I would say, I guess to answer the question would be, I think it would be really interesting to see what kind of research there is out there already and what maybe there isn't any.
There is.
Yeah, so I personally would be really interested to see, what is already out there.
Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're looking at the new relationship that I call them the new government. It's not as new now, but the current federal government has talked about a new relationship as a high priority. And in my region of Nunavut, the Prime Minister has already convened a meeting of all the presidents of all the regional Inuit associations, and they've set up a subcommittee. They're going to meet with like 4 or 5 cabinet ministers more than once a year, and the Prime Minister is going to meet once a year. And I'm just thinking, listening to you and your call for youth engagement, and listening to, Jacquelyn Cardinal talk about supporting grassroots initiatives, and Tiffany saying, talk to people who are affected. I wonder if you'd agree that maybe instead of the top-down approach that I want to not criticize the Prime Minister, it's a noble effort, but it is with the leaders that at the very top of the Aboriginal organizations. I wonder if you'd recommend that, because we're looking at doing some regional visits to various parts of the country in the next part of this study. I wonder if you'd recommend that we work, maybe reach out to people like you, working at a community center involving families and working with youth and recommending youth engagement. If we go out to regions, maybe we make an effort to connect with the people who are affected. I think somebody said that tonight. Tiffany said that tonight. You know, people like you're talking about, rather than the elected leaders of political organizations that have been there for decades. Would that be a good direction? Do you think people like yourself could help us reach out to those youth you say we should be engaged with, which are such a high proportion of the and growing proportion of the Aboriginal population?
Yeah, I think what really worked best for me, and I mean, I'll just be blunt about it, is when I really realized that when I was about 17, 18, that, I mean, technically my social worker works for me, and then her job is just at the office. And that some of her days are spent, you know, having to meet with me and stuff. And someone told me that, and I didn't really realize that. I always just thought, like, I have to pick up her phone calls and I have to see her. And then they said, well, actually, she's supposed to be advocating on your behalf. So, you know, when you go today, let her know that you need lunch and see what happens. And I was like, okay, that's like super weird, but I'll do it. And I met with her, and then we were sitting there, and she was talking to me about potentially moving again, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, that's really great. Could we get lunch? And just as like a tester. And she was like, yeah, great. Where do you want to go? And I was like, oh my gosh, advocacy's real. And I think for a lot of young people, when they are given the opportunity, as we see here today, that they are able to talk, and they do want to talk. And I think that there's even newer issues that relate to the young people now that are in care that are even so probably far different from when I was in care. But probably a lot of the same issues still come up around moving and around aging out and around not having permanent connections, and that there's too many people swapping in and out of a young person's life that they can't connect to anybody, and then they are left at 19 alone. And then what are they left with? Like, nothing. I have seen young people that I know personally that I've just tried to help mentor a little bit and sort of get them jobs and stuff, seen them do total 360s from living on the street to now living in the artist building where I live, and they've succeeded me and have gone beyond that. And I think it could just start with just giving them an opportunity to be heard, or it could just be, yeah, giving them some time with Justin Trudeau or whoever goes. I think it's very important. And I think that the people who go that day are the people who are meant to be there too. So I would say yes to the suggestion of, like, yeah, the regional visits I think are very important, and I think it would be very useful, and I would love to help with that. So,
thank you.
Senator Rain, did you have a quick question?
Quick one, yes. Thank you very much, Chris. For me, it's been very interesting today. I don't know a lot about the foster care system, and I understand it's different from one province to another. But it seems to me if there's a child who it looks like is going to be going from home to home along the way, you need to have some way, and you've gone through it now, you'd be in a position to maybe look at this, of saying, what are the skills that most children learn from their family? How can those skills and that background be given to these people with a group of supporters around them that stay with them through that journey? Would that be something that you could flush out and maybe work on? Because I think it needs to be done. You're absolutely right.
yeah, I think personally that there's so many skills I learned, like talking with different people and treating everyone fairly, even though a lot of the time it's like, you know, my parents are being underpaid, and that's probably why they don't like me. That was always my joke growing up in care. They're just not doing their job right. They just don't get paid enough. And so I feel that, and I talk to youth in care now, that I say, like, you know, what does it feel like to live in a foster home now or whatever? And they're like, oh, you don't even know. Like, it's so different. And then they actually start talking about some of the root things that they're struggling with. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I had that similar struggle. I mean, I didn't have Twitter, Facebook, or whatever back in the day, but, I mean, same struggle, like, ultimately, talking about permanency and the bigger things around housing and really being able to reach other goals other than just getting housing. Especially within the city in Vancouver, it's very expensive. It's very ridiculously expensive. It is expensive. And so I think working with these young people, helping them develop, because a lot of them do have skills and do have other things on the back burner. Whenever I met any young person, like I see them drawing or I see them doing this thing, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. What is that? And they'll show me this whole like animation thing, and I'm like, what? This is like a cartoon idea to go to like a tech mogul or like somebody, you know, and they're just like, oh, I just do this for fun. It's not really like a job or anything. I'm like, this is literally a career you are working on, and you don't even realize it. So I think there's so much potential there, and I think with me, when I realized that I could public speak and make a difference, that's when I realized this is like, oh, and I can ask, you know, ridiculous amounts of money to do this, because I'm like the only Aboriginal youth like doing this, you know, and I'm a rare commodity. And you know, when I started realizing these things, you know, it really started putting the pieces together for me. And so I think it would help other young people to help develop their skills, if I'm perceiving the question correctly, and also help them work on things that they're not so good at, which, you know, could be a various number of things. I think the biggest thing actually within foster care that definitely needs to be looked at is like things like conflict resolution, things like being transparent with foster parents and with youth, because it felt like, at least personally for me, that when I was in care, I felt like I didn't get to have a say. My foster parents got a say. I would move out, and then I, you know, had this file, and so people would read my file and get this perception. I'm like, well, that was me yesterday. Like, to be honest, I'm a different person today. I don't know what I'm person going to be like tomorrow, but like I can tell you that's not me. And I think my experience really spoke to that with some folks. And it is really weird to think now that I am more connected with foster families I lived with previously, but now as an adult, because they've become huge fans, and you know they support my work 100%. And sometimes when I see them, I'm like, man, it would have been cool if you supported me, you know, when I was in care, but that's okay. Forgive and forget. So I think, yeah, I think developing, especially youth in care, their skill set and being able to find ways to give them funding to do school, whatever it is they need, it's there. And I feel like there's so much potential within young people today, both youth in care and not, especially within Indigenous youth. So, cool.
Thank you. Well, we have gone past our time by quite a few minutes, but it was certainly worth it. And our clerk just wrote out, wow. We've had an amazing evening this evening, having you 9 youth leaders with us this evening, providing us with your gems of wisdom and rooting us in reality, but also giving us some very concrete ideas to move forward. And on behalf of all the senators of the committee, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for being with us tonight and giving us such wonderful testimony that will inform our study. And we will be in touch with you throughout this journey, I'm sure. Thank you very much. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Here, here.